I had someone ask me last night what was the subject matter of the first panel, and I had to tell them, well, it was the title of the first panel is "What is the Matter with Congress?" And they said, I hope you have about a month to discuss it because an hour is not going to be nearly enough. But I think that the panel we have here this morning to talk about these issues is a very well qualified group to make this presentation to all of you, to also our scholars here this morning. You know them just by looking at who they are, but Norm Dix, obviously, in the great state of Washington, senior member of the Appropriations Committee, a person who knew how to get things done, working on both sides of the aisle in a very polarized House of Representatives. The next guys and lady all the way down the line are all former United States senators, but they also have something else in common. They were also former members of the House of Representatives. So they bring that perspective of what it was like to be in the House and then moving on to the United States Senate and the changes that occurred between the two different bodies, and both from a Republican and a Democratic perspective. So I want to, Byron Dorgan was a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, the Energy Committee. He continues his work in that regard with the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, continues to work here in the city. Next to him, of course, is my partner in the Patent Boggs law firm, Trent Lott. Trent was a former majority leader. He was a former minority leader, so he's seen it from both sides, also obviously in the House and in the Senate. He also partnered with the next guy, Tom Daschle. Tom, a House member, he was also a minority leader and a majority leader as well. These guys have so much in common. I've said many times that these two individuals spoke more in one day than some of the leaders in Congress today speak in a year, because they simply don't speak. There is for the problem of how do you run a government when the leaders are not engaged in daily conversations with each other about how to solve the many problems that they're facing. And of course, Blanche Lincoln, also House and Senate member, served with great distinction, chairman of the Agriculture Committee from the state of Arkansas, also on the Energy Committee, a person who also reached across party lines to put things together for the people that she represented and brings that knowledge to this discussion. And she continues to work here in the city in the Austin Bird law firm, and still trying to put things together to make government work better for all of us. So let me just start it off and thank them all very much for agreeing to do this session, and maybe in no particular order. I mean, let me ask the question and then see how we respond. What's the biggest difference between how Congress seemingly works, or perhaps maybe doesn't work so well today, and what it was when you all were there? And maybe let me shoot this over to the two former leaders, both Democrat and majority leaders, Tom Daschle and Trent. What's the differences that you see today from when you were there, which wasn't that long ago, just a couple of years ago? Tom?
Well, John, I think probably one of the biggest differences is the amount of time that members spend in Washington today. I often say that the airplane is a big reason why we find ourselves in the situation we do, because what it has done is accommodated travel far more frequently. And Blanche was just telling me she was actually criticized for moving her children to Washington. Well, it virtually doesn't happen anymore. No one moves their family to Washington. And because so little time is spent here, in fact, I think we've set the record this year so far for the fewest number of votes cast. And so I think that's one of the big differences, is that if you're not here, it's pretty hard to build friendships and relationships and ultimately to accommodate the kind of legislative processes required that's built on those relationships. So
I was actually sued one time back in Louisiana, and the plaintiff alleged that I couldn't run because I had a house in Washington. And he tried to disqualify me because he said I lived in Washington. I kept saying, that's where the job is. I mean, where you want me to live in Louisiana and never come to work, or you want me to live where I'm working? And the court luckily threw it out. Trent?
Well, first, John and John and Tom and I have all done events like this together so much that I'll use their words and give them no attribution, which is what you can do in the Senate. I want to thank Bob Mann and LSU and Connie for making this possible. I thought this was an SEC event, so I don't know where the Ole Miss and Arkansas material is. Got all this LSU stuff out there, but I think this is a great idea, and we appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. You know, John and Tom and I have talked a lot about the differences now and the way it used to be. I did come to Washington in 1968 as a staff member to a Democrat. It was a lot different in those days. No fax machines, no computers, no cell phones. I think the members had 6 round trips home a year. Members brought their family, they stayed here. Of course, the Congress, even in those days, didn't stay beyond usually, say, October. They'd go home, so their children actually went to school back in their home districts. And that was a long time ago. And then, of course, fast forward through my House years in the 70s and 80s and then in the Senate. I think a lot of it is modern technology. You know, you are under pressure to keep up with what's going on instantaneously. People can reach you all hours of the day and night. You've got the 24/7 news media. If you make a mistake or if you get involved, you know, in something that you shouldn't have, I guarantee you it'll be on the news for several days running. So that's part of it. But I also think John's right. What we really need, and I don't want to be too critical of the leaders because I know how tough their job is, but to get things done, you do have to have men and women that are really willing to work together, to step up. When I went from the House to the Senate, I was a partisan warrior. You know, having been the whip in the House, in the minority for 16 years, I went in every day trying to figure out a way I could, you know, defeat the other side. And after a few months, I said, you know what, this is not working. I'm not happy. I'm not getting anything done. I got to figure out how this institution works, and I got to change my attitude and try to find a way to help get some things done. And part of it was being willing to, you know, amble across the aisle and talk to John Breaux and say, hey, what can we get done together? And being willing to work with Norm Dix and with Tom Daschle. And Tom and I did talk a lot. Tom and I sometimes took on our conferences. I remember one time in particular, neither his caucus nor my conference was ready to go on a bill. But we knew it needed to be done, and we stepped up and said we're going to move this bill, and we got it done. So I do think a second problem I'll point out is the need to have strong leadership, and it's an overused term, but regular order is really needed. Let the committees have hearings. Let the subcommittees mark up. Let the full committee mark up. Have votes. I can't believe senators don't want to have to cast a tough vote. You got a 6-year term. You don't want to have to vote on immigration reform or, you know, defense issues. Go to the floor and have a full debate, and then go to conference. I think they've had like one real conference maybe in the last couple of years. That's where the final work needs to be done. So I would think that would help an awful lot. And Harry Reid, the current majority leader, talks about doing that more, and he's done it a couple of times, and they got a result. So I think that would be a big important improvement to go back to.
Norm Dix, tell us a little bit about the House of Representatives perspective. Mickey?
Well,
Mickey's over there?
First, I want to thank John and everyone for having this event, and the people from LSU and the people from George Washington. You know, in the House of Representatives, you know, if you're in the minority, you recognize that the other side it has the responsibility every day to put 218 votes up on the board. And what I tried to do when we were in the minority after the 2010 election, I became ranking Democrat on the House Appropriations Committee. The previous chairman and the previous ranking member had a dreadful relationship. And I walked into Hal Rogers' office from Kentucky and I said, we cannot have this same kind of a problem. And here's what I think we should do. And Hal Rogers was completely in sync with me. He said, we have got to, as Trent said, we've got to reestablish regular order on the Appropriations Committee. And in our first year, we took the previous year's appropriations bill, which was a continuing resolution. We probably were on the floor, HR 1. We were on the floor for like 6 or 7 days, open rule, and with over 1,000 amendments, and we passed the thing. And last year, in 2013, we passed 6 bills, took it from subcommittee, full committee, on the House floor. We also had open rules. And we tried to establish something so that we could pass these bills and send them to the other body. Well, we sent them to the other body, and the other body didn't take up one appropriation bill except for the continuing resolution. It was just, I mean, you could do all this hard work and all this, and I went around to every Democrat and said, listen, we have an interest in open rules and having a chance to offer an amendment. And so I don't want to hear anybody saying we shouldn't be cooperating with Rogers. And nobody did. I mean, Barney Frank said a few things, but you know, you expect that. But the bottom line is there is a way to do this if you can get both sides, and it makes it much more difficult if you do all this hard work, get all this stuff done in the House of Representatives, and then see it go to the Senate and die. Every single Democratic House member that gets elected to the Senate, I go up to them and I tell them one thing. You've got to change the rules in the Senate. And I say this as a former Senate staffer to Warren Magnuson. I was there for 8 years. The most productive, from 68 to 76, the most productive time in recent history in the United States Congress. We had 67 Democratic senators. No one ever thought there'd be a Republican Senate. The House was overwhelmingly Democrat, and Richard Nixon was president. We passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, created the Environmental Protection Agency. It was one of the most productive times. And why? Because when people got here, the elections were over, and they said, let's work together. Every bill had a Democratic sponsor and a Republican sponsor. Every bill was basically worked out to be bipartisan. And we passed legislation. It was an amazing time. And what I see now is this bitter hyper-partisanship that has creeped into our politics. The book by Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein, the Brookings Institute, American Enterprise Institute, says it perfectly. This acrimony and hyper-bipartisanship have seeped into every part of the political process. Congress is deadlocked and its approval ratings are at record lows. America's two main political parties have given up their tradition of compromise, endangering our very system of constitutional democracy. And one of these parties, this doesn't refer to anybody at this table because all were great leaders, has taken on the role of insurgent outlier. The Republicans have become ideologically extreme, scornful of compromise, and ardently opposed to the established social and economic policy regime. And we don't believe in science anymore. You can't mention climate change. Keynesian economics is no longer even considered in the House of Representatives in terms of how do we get this economy turned around. So, but there are pockets of hope. I mean, if the committees restore themselves. One of the things that I think is really seriously wrong is so few pieces of major legislation today start in the subcommittee, go through the full committee, go to the floor, that goes to the Senate, have a conference. That just doesn't happen. Things get imposed. This is it. You've got to take it like it is. And that's not the way we legislated when we were doing all that good work over in the Senate between 1968 and 76. So
Thank you very much,
it's a
Norm.
serious problem.
Norm would argue that he was more powerful when he was a chief of staff to Warren Magnuson in the Senate.
I said the New York Times asked me that question. And I said, I never thought I'd give up that much power voluntarily.
I want to apologize to Mickey Edwards. Mickey's on the other side of Mark Kennedy over there. Mickey, I didn't see you sitting down there, and I'm gonna get
so tall, John.
Yeah, he's not as tall as Mark. I didn't see him down there. He served in the Congress for about over 15 years and was a real leader in a lot of energy areas. He's written a number of books. He's vice president of the Aspen Institute and doing a terrific job in the city and a great appropriator as well. Mickey, why don't you make a comment here?
Well, you know, part of it is exactly what we just said. We have gotten so far away from the regular order, which was where people who had knowledge of the issues and who had a special interest in advancing, whether it's agricultural issues or environmental issues, or whatever, would sit down and work it out. Today it tends to be coming from the top down, where it's a messaging issue. It's more about how you frame the message in order to win the next election than it is to deal with the legislative problem that you've got. So that's part of it. Part of it, which I'll talk about in a little bit, my role here is to talk more about some of the party things that I've seen. More and more, because I love the guys who are sitting up here who took roles as leaders, and they consider themselves legislative leaders. I think more and more the people today who are in leadership positions in the House and Senate see themselves as party leaders. And they too have lost the idea of how do we get something done so that you can, keep the water pure and keep the bridges from collapsing and, things like that are the responsibilities of Congress. So a lot of it is that even in the leadership ranks, there has been a diminishing idea of what it means when you take the oath of office. It doesn't mean how can you position your party to win the next election.
That's a very good point. Blanche, you want to jump in here?
Absolutely. Well, thanks, John. I appreciate you and LSU putting this together, and I'm feeling very honored to be on this distinguished panel with a lot of great friends and folks that have done a tremendous amount. I'd like to just touch on a couple of things, and those are the things that I think are most important for us to use in trying to change things. One of the things that's critically important that's missing on Capitol Hill, I think, today is time. It's time for members to be able to grow the respect and the relationships that they need to have the respect for one another so that they can do what it is that they need to do, and that is come together and find the center ground. Find where you agree and then move from that. I do agree, I'm not sure who really mentioned it, but the parties have created this issue of leadership as it meaning control. Leadership doesn't mean control. I'm sitting next to some leaders here that they weren't in there to control. Leadership means creating an environment where people feel comfortable coming to the table and offering their ideas. They feel respected by other people that they're working with. That's what real leadership means. It means really bringing together people in an environment where they feel comfortable looking for the answers. I think that's a really critical thing for us to think about in terms of leadership, whether it's leadership in the Congress, leadership in the parties, or what have you. And I think the key word in there is respect. The way that you respect one another is by getting to know them. And you cannot get to know people if you do not spend time with them. The idea of maybe once a month doing a caucus together as opposed to going off into your separate rooms, the Democrats in one and the Republicans in another. The events that we used to have where we went, Tom Carper to this day still talks about my boys in a baseball game that we played. They were 6, and he was up against them pitching and they were batting and, getting to know one another. When I first came, my predecessor, Dale Bumpers, who spent 4 terms in the United States Senate, said to me, he said, I know that you'll do a great job. I'm really proud of you. He said, I only wish you could know the Senate that I knew. He said, I'm more liberal than you are. He said, but my best friends, some of my best friends were Republicans. And he said, it wasn't because we agreed on the policy. He said it was because we were friends. We raised our kids together. We had to go to those awful band concerts together. We had to, do the kind of things that create relationships. And he kept encouraging me to travel on the Codells. He said, you really get to know your colleagues. And that wasn't an option for me. I was very, very young. Looking back, naivety was my greatest asset, I think. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to be here. But, it's funny. I had young children. My dad was in failing health, my mother-in-law. There were just many other things that I had to do that I did not want to wake up one day and regret that I hadn't been there for. But I made it an effort to make sure that I went to every one of those spouse dinners. And I made Steve Lincoln come. And I made us sit at a table that somebody we did not know. And he said, why are we sitting with these people? Why are we doing? I said, because we don't know them, and we need to know them. These are people that I work with who are making a difference in this world, and we need to know who they are. And it was hysterical. I never will forget the first time I sat next to Judd Gregg and his wife. All of a sudden, we walked out of there, and Judd looked at me and he said, am I buying your piano? And I said, well, your wife and I have been talking about this. Something that never would have happened had we not gotten to know one another and gotten to be better friends. And even though we may have disagreed, we respected one another enough to try to find that common ground. And the last thing that I would just add is one time, I hope that's a thing that's been picked up. You've got to have the time for that. You've got to know and understand what real leadership is about. The last thing is regular order. And I don't think you'll find a member who has enjoyed regular order or the ability to conference a bill, which I did, and whether it was farm bills or Dodd-Frank or other things, but conferencing a bill, as Mickey says, when people go through that regular order in committee, you really do have that environment where you can bring your knowledge to the table and talk across the aisle and figure out, well, that's not exactly what I wanted. Well, it's not what I wanted either. Well, is there somewhere where we can come together? We got to get this done because it's 2 in the morning and I want to get home. But those are the kind of things that make a difference. But I will say there's a very bright young woman in this room who's a graduate of LSU who taught me one time, a lot of people don't understand the language we use. And I'll be honest with you, most people don't know what regular order means. And we have to explain that to the American people so that they know that when we take the time to spend 6 months on a bill, it's because we are going through the process that our forefathers found to be the most productive in bringing ideas to the table and coming up with consensus that moves us forward. And so it's the language we speak. It's all of those great things, and I have a ton more to say, but I overtalk my outwear my welcome sometimes.
Thank you, Blanche.
Absolutely. Will I yield? Will I yield?
Let's get.
At one point, and I'll let it go, but one of my proudest moments was one night Blanche came to me. It was about 5:30, and we were having votes, and she said, well, my son's got a baseball game tonight. Are we going to keep having votes? I said, Blanche, if you need to go to this baseball game, we won't have any more votes tonight. I'll see you tomorrow.
And he was true to his word. And the great thing about it was he knew that we weren't going to, there wasn't much more that was going to happen that night, but they kind of lead people on to think that we're going to do more and more and more and more, and you just sit around and, but it was,
Trent always wanted to get home before the sun set.
That's right. It's a good thing.
Let's hear from Byron Dorgan. Byron, any comments on the subject?
Well, I agree with a lot of what has been said, and I think that, but first of all, I should say thanks, John and LSU. I came here in 1980 and learned quickly that John Breaux spent more time on the tennis court than in the library at LSU.
That's true.
I found that out the hard way, by the way. I think the culture has...
And on the Bennett Johnson tennis court in the United States Senate.
That's right.
With Byron Dorgan.
I think there's been a culture change in the Congress in the way it works. There's no question about that. And the question is what has caused that and what could be done to remedy it. I think when I go back to when I showed up, I believe that you were rewarded for compromise and punished for obstruction. By that I mean, if you were a senator or congressman and you spent most of your time trying to find compromises and pass legislation, generally speaking, you were rewarded in your caucus, you were rewarded by your constituents. And if you spent most of your time being a real pain and deciding, I'm going to be a set of human brake pads, I'm going to stop everything to the extent I can, you were largely punished by your caucus and by your constituents. Now, I think it's safe to say that obstructionism is largely rewarded and compromise is punished. I think this will be controversial, so bear with me for a moment. I think since the late 1980s, for reasons that the FCC took, the growth of talk radio and cable television has meant the following. You have a playing floor with the politicians on the playing floor in the U.S. Congress. Then you have the bleacher section, and in the recent decades, that bleacher section now has microphones. And some microphones extend to 15 and 20 million people a day. And so they watch the floor, that playing floor, and they say, oh, look at that person. That person is compromising and therefore not standing up for their principles. Shame on that person. Shame on them. And it is, you pay a very significant price in Congress if you are compromising these days, because the master narrative is that compromise means that you don't stand for your principles. So that, I think, has had a profound impact on politics in this town. Now, it's controversial because when you talk about that, somebody says, well, you're blaming this or that. Let me just say, I think that, there needs to be joint caucuses. And in almost every enterprise in life, you would try to figure out with the people you're with, what's the strategy? What do we need to get done, and how do we do it? That's not the case in Congress these days. The question is, what's the strategy for our caucus, not for our country? And to use a metaphor of baseball, it's very much like a baseball game where you have two dugouts. And you never see people go back and forth between the dugouts at all. There's their team and there's our team. There's Republicans and Democrats. Now, what do we want? We want the other side to lose. Well, that didn't exist. Some of you talked about the history of it. That didn't exist decades ago. Decades ago, ranking members and chairmen and the men and women who served there, by and large, would get together and decide, what do we have to do for the country? What deadlines do we have to meet? How are we going to meet them? And they ran their caucuses, and that gets back to the issue of leadership, which was mentioned first. Leadership that says, let's try to run these caucuses. But leadership is much more difficult now, if not impossible, when you're trying to deal with cable television and talk radio and a whole series of things back home in a constituency that says, you know what, we're going to tune in to listen to those things on the radio and television, and only that which reinforces our existing belief. And they're going to tell us whether our person is one of those people that is not standing for principles, but in fact is compromising. We call it a four-letter word, and we hate four-letter words, and we're going to punish those that are compromisers. So I think all of those things play a role here, and I think some of the suggestions earlier about joint caucuses, I think weekend retreats with both parties, including families. Tom talked about time, I think it was. People come here for 3-4 days a week, and then they're gone. All of that, I think, has pulled people apart. And it's very hard to deal with people if you're not friends and don't have respect for their personal needs and their interests. So I think all of these, this can be remedied, but it's hard. And the country desperately needs leadership and an understanding that compromise is the lubrication of democracy. It is the only way democracy can possibly work. When you believe something and I believe something very different, we come together in good fellowship and decide, here's where we can meet in the middle to help advance the country's interests.
John, we went around the loop, and I just add one thing that wasn't raised, and I think it just has to be raised in the context of a conversation like this, and that's the money chase. A typical senator has to raise $10,000 a day for his entire term. The two most expensive races in the last cycle exceeded $80 million. And so there is little doubt that we will break the $100 million threshold at some point in the not-too-distant future. The money chase takes people away from the work they're supposed to do, and it does all the polarizing that we're talking about in so many ways, too, with the we-theys. And I just think it's also a factor that really has to be on the table as we look at these other circumstances.
Well said. Let me move on to another little subject. I thought there was a real breakthrough this week in the leaders working together, because I saw Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, on the Senate floor Monday, both giving remarks and speeches, one following the other, where they actually totally agreed. The only problem was they were talking about how great a baseball player Bryce Harper was. And then immediately after they did that, they went back to slugging it out on the floor about procedure. There was a headline in the Hill magazine on the Hill, and it's something somebody referred to on the panel, and it's Senate Democrats, a nuclear option is back on the table. And of course that refers to the question of whether the Democratic leader, Harry Reid, would move to change the Senate rules to limit the filibuster rule. And of course the Republican leader in the minority is very strongly against that. And previous Congresses, when the tables were reversed, when Mitch McConnell was trying to change the rules, Harry Reid, as the member of the minority on the filibuster rule, was totally opposed to it. So I guess to see if any of our colleagues would have a comment on whether you think the current filibuster rules in the Senate are part of the problem. Should it be changed? Does it work? Or why should it be changed, or why not? Any comments, Tom?
I just spoke. I probably shouldn't do it again, but let me quickly start, and then Trent and I have talked about this many times, well, and several of other on the dais here. But I think, John, you know, you look at 1917 to 1967. If I recall, we had 52 cloture votes in a little over 50 years, 1917 to 1967. I believe the number is 52. We had 112 cloture votes in the 110th Congress, or 111th Congress. And so we had twice as many in one Congress as we did in 50 years. I think there are two things that really could at least be considered. One is that we now dual and triple and quadruple track. When there's a filibuster, we set the bill aside and we take up another bill. So we've diminished the pain involved with a filibuster simply by saying we're not going to use time on the floor to make that happen. And I think that really is a factor that really has minimized the impact of a filibuster, and it's why there's so many. We thought it was a reform. It's really not. But dual and triple tracking, that is setting the bill aside and just taking up something else, is one thing that we ought to reconsider. The second thing is holding the floor. If people really had to hold the floor and retain the recognition of the floor during that time they're filibustering, it could really also alter the dynamic that occurs. You're not allowed to, or not required to keep the floor any longer, and that also is a
Rand Paul do that
14 hours, right?
Holding the floor, and then he gave it up.
Exactly. But you're not required to do that anymore. And those two factors have really changed the dynamics of filibusters. Dual tracking and not being required to hold the floor any longer.
Trent, do you have a comment from the Republican side?
Well, you know, you should always consider ways that you can do a better job. Reform of the institution or the rules is something that you shouldn't just reject out of hand. But, as you might expect, I say be careful what you wish for, because you might get it. And, you know, I do believe that the Senate is a unique institution, and you do look for supermajorities. It can happen. The Senate passed a bill last week, a bipartisan bill, with 69 votes. But they had an open process, they had amendments, and they produced a product. You know, Tom and I used to try to do some reforms. We found you had to do it gingerly. We had a problem with holes. This is one of the things that makes senators nervous or dangerous. And that is, some freshman senator shows up now and he figures out real quick, or she does, hey, I can stop this whole damn institution. I can impose a hole. And by the way, I'll go back to my office and hide where they can't find me. And they don't even, used to, they didn't even have to acknowledge that they were doing it. So Tom and I, on 2 occasions, tried to reform the hole a little bit more, because to at least, you know, make the senator do it, him or herself, or, and acknowledge that they were doing it, a few things like that. I thought that the little reform they came up with earlier this year was a movement in the right direction. I always had a problem, frankly, with filibustering the motion to proceed. What you were saying is, I don't want him to debate the issue. You know, I would be inclined ordinarily to let that go, and if you're going to filibuster the bill itself. So you can always look for some reforms, but I do think that there is a uniqueness. When you get the Senate to come up with a super vote, whether it's, you know, 61 or 60 or 70, more than likely you pull the country together with you. I think that's one of the problems we've had with Obamacare. It passed by such a close margin. It was so partisan, and the nation was divided 50-50 without getting into the substance. I think that's one of the problems that we've had. We never really got enough input, and I don't say the Republicans weren't to blame for some of that, because they wouldn't engage to a degree. I mean, those that did try to engage, like Olympia Snowe, wound up getting hammered. So I just say on reform, you should always think about what you can do, but just like Democrats, I would warn now, if you change the filibuster rule, if Republicans someday do come back in the majority, then it's going to work against you. I also feel like that we should look at ways to improve the confirmation process. It's ridiculous. And Schumer and Lamar Alexander came up with a plan to take 300 and something nominations to commissions and bureaus out of the confirmation process. But I think we should look at that a little bit more. You know, there are a lot of Obama administration nominees up there right now I'd vote against. But I would make sure that they had the vote. And I really think the president is entitled to his cabinet. And even if you struggle with voting for them, just like on Supreme Court nominees, I voted for Justice Ginsburg. I knew philosophically I wouldn't agree with her, but she met the basic criteria. She was qualified. She had a good demeanor. So I couldn't bring myself to vote against her, but I got hammered because I voted for her. I could go on about this a long time, but reform in and of itself can be good, but it's not absolutely good, and you got to always weigh the consequences down the line.
Let me see if our two House colleagues have any thoughts about the Senate rules.
Being a former Senate staffer, I feel. Now, Trent, let me ask you again. Just last week, or maybe it was earlier this week, there was going to be a confirmation hearing for Gina McCarthy. Now, this woman is qualified to be the administrator of EPA of anyone I know. I mean, literally, she's done this in other states. She's been very fair, and nobody shows up. The Republicans don't show up at the meeting. And I think that's really hard to understand.
Well, there is a bit of revisionist history that we indulge in about how wonderful it used to be and how bad it is now. Hey, the idea that one party or the other would boycott a markup or a confirmation hearing, we didn't just create that. There was one in the Commerce Committee way back in the 60s where a senator from Texas was trying to get a senator from South Carolina to go into markup so they could get the necessary quorum there. They wound up in the ante room, the one from South Carolina throwing the one from Texas on the floor.
Was that Strom Thurmond?
That was Strom Thurmond and Yarborough, I think it was. Now, so this is a technique that's been used before. The argument, the argument would be is that look, we've got information, we've got questions we think should be answered, and if they haven't got the answers, they ought to get them. I think at some point the committee should, in fact, give the nominee a vote. I would vote against her if I were in the Senate, but I also, if I were in the leadership, working with Tom Daschle, I would work to find a way for her to have a vote. This is the president's nominee. She ought to at least have a vote.
Mickey,
I have a problem with her nomination.
Mickey Edwards, any perspective on those Senate filibuster rules?
Well, I don't have any problem with the idea of a filibuster. I think filibuster is a very important part of the process. I would like to go back to the time when you required a senator to be present, and I would make it easier to cut it off. That maybe you start with requiring, 60 so that the person who has a complaint can be heard. The other senators can hear his or her complaint, the country can hear it, and then after a week or so you say, okay, now it takes 58, then it takes 55, then it takes 50. Okay, we heard you, now we're going to act. And I think that's one thing that would make it a lot better. It's not the idea of having a filibuster, it's the idea of having a filibuster all the time with no effort being put out in order to do it, and making it almost impossible to cut it off.
Let me tell you why the leader does not force the old-fashioned filibuster. Because the one thing the majority leader has the least of is time. He's got a whole agenda, or she does in the future, that he's got or she's got to try to move. And if you say, okay, look, we're going to stop on this line, and by George, you're going to filibuster, that means nominations, other bills, everything else that's backing up. I used to get in that bind, and I'm sure Tom did too. So there are some reasons why the old-fashioned filibusters aren't enforced, in effect, by the majority leader.
I agree with Trent, except that I would just say right now it's become even more dysfunctional than in the old days when you used to have a filibuster. Yeah. I mean, we didn't have a cloture vote until 1917, and ironically, it was Woodrow Wilson who wrote his doctorate thesis against a cloture vote and in favor of unlimited filibusters that orchestrated the effort to get a cloture vote and make that part of the Senate rules in 1917 to accommodate World War I.
When did it go from 67 votes to 60?
73.
Civil rights debates. Let's move on to maybe another subject, and one of the questions that has been suggested to me is why has the Senate become almost as partisan as the House? And I was thinking that, well, because half of the Senate are former House members. And I think there's about 48 former senators who are former House members now. But I think there was a viewpoint that in the past, maybe that has changed. I'd like the panel to comment, that the House was more partisan for a number of reasons, the structure of the district, running every 2 years, et cetera. More partisan than the Senate, and now it seems to some that that has changed and they both are as extremely partisan as either side. Anybody want to comment on that? Has it changed, Norm?
One thing I'd mention is in the House of Representatives, we have a Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee can limit debate and make it possible for the majority to bring out a bill and pass it under reasonable circumstances. That makes a huge difference. Now, the one thing that happened in the last 2 years is that the Republican majority could not put up the 218 votes on almost anything. And at least on 5 or 6 of the appropriation bills, they couldn't have passed the appropriation bills without Democratic support. And on the continuing resolution, there was 165 Republicans and 164 Democrats. So I would argue that the ruling majority in the House of Representatives today truly is about 180 Democrats and 70 Republicans. Whenever Boehner wants to pull the string and he can stand up to his Republican Tea Party people and there has to be something passed of importance to the country, there is a working majority.
Well, you know, the House was created and structured to represent the passions of the moment and the politics of the day. So that's not unusual that the House would be more partisan than the Senate, generally speaking. But I think there's very little change or very little difference these days, except in the 2-year versus a 6-year term, with social media, talk radio, cable television, and particularly social media now. It is real-time politics for everybody. It doesn't matter what that last vote was. That last vote on all the social media devices and the communication capabilities puts senators not in a 6-year cocoon where it's not going to matter so much, not going to notice so much. It's the same in the House and the Senate in terms of the introspection of how this person is behaving. Are they, as I've said before, to be punished for compromising or rewarded for obstruction? So that has had this communication cycle that we're in has had a profound impact, I think, on both the way the House and the Senate behave.
Blanche?
Well, I just want to echo, because I think Byron's right. I mean, these modern times and what they bring, just the difference between running a campaign in 2004 and running a campaign in 2010. Oh my gosh. I mean, whether it was Facebook or Twitter, you know, any of those things, it was every second. Every second you are answerable to whatever's going on in that second, and the expectations. The other is the expectations. Someone talked about the travel and what have you. I never will forget in the House, I had a group in my constituencies. It was a group that wanted me to come speak to their association. And it was a Wednesday night. And my office said, you know, there's votes on Tuesday, there's votes on Wednesdays, there's votes on Thursdays. And they said, well, we've looked at the schedule and there's a flight out at like 5:30, 5:45. She could be here probably by 8 or 8:30, speak and turn around. And then there's a 6 a.m. flight that would get her back in time. And it's that expectation of all these modern comforts. Who was it that said travel? I guess airplanes. Airplanes. I think the other was air conditioning. No, we're not against airplanes at all. But the expectations they create is an issue. And the expectation that modern technology provides in communication, it creates an expectation that really takes away the opportunity for members to spend the kind of quality time debating the issues and the differences to come up with consensus.
John, can I jump in here? I want to give you some hope. You know, you're thinking, oh my God, it's terrible and there's no hope that it'll get better. I think it will, and I'm not trying to, you know, condemn any particular individual or even a group, but a lot of the leaders now, frankly, are our contemporaries. And they came up through times of difficulty and battle and partisanship. I do see a hope, and a glimmer of hope at least, that the next generation of leaders, they're hearing what the American people are not happy. You look at the approval rating of the Congress. What is it? Is it still in double digits? Yeah, it's nowhere. Members are hearing that. They didn't realize, well, we got to find a way to get more things done. That's why right now, Barbara Boxer and David Bitter are on the floor of the Senate. They're going to pass a water resources bill. Hal Rogers has told me, Norm, he likes you, but he loves Barbara Mikulski. They're dating now. Or something.
But the only hope there is, can Barbara and Richard Shelby get Harry Reid to let them do anything?
Well, that is a problem. But they're feeling the pressure, and they know they're not liked or respected the way they should be. And I think on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Capitol, the next generation of leaders will be different. Will they be perfect? Will they be great? Maybe not, probably not. But you look down the line of who's coming up, and for a Republican, you take some of the leaders that are down the line a little bit from Harry. They'll be tough adversaries, but I know for a fact you can work with them, or as we say where John Breaux and I are from, you can do business for the good of New York State, or for Mississippi and Louisiana after Katrina. You can find a way to get things done. And another thing that Tom and I used to do, we talked. Occasionally we would help each other, run interference with each other, but also every now and then I'd do something I shouldn't have done, like fill up the tree where there could be no amendments offered. First time I did that, I thought Tom was going to blow a gasket. And we actually apologized to each other occasionally. We actually confessed our sins to each other, which tends to bond you. And I think maybe we had a unique relationship, but boy, it sure helps when you have leaders that do really kind of like each other and feel like we gotta find a way to get things done.
No, it's so true. I mean, Trent and I have become very, very close friends, and I treasure the friendship. The one thing another thing we haven't really talked about, and I may be the only one who thinks this, but I do think the primary process today in both parties is also influencing the next generation of people who are getting elected. We've seen indications of that recently. I just think when the primary becomes the more important of the two elections, well, that's part of it.
Into what you're talking
Absolutely, it's redistricting and the primaries. And and the primaries back in the 60s and 70s were considered a reform. It gave the people more of an opportunity to have a voice. But because of low voter turnout in primaries, it's not hard to capture the majority in a primary election. And so groups on the far left and the far right are doing that with greater frequency and success. And that elects a different person when the primary becomes the more important of the two elections. We've got to figure out ways to ensure that that general election is still the most important of the two elections.
Let me raise the point, and it's been alluded to with regard to the House. More and more members in the House are from what we would call safe congressional districts, where you have a district that is comprised of 75% Democrats, 25% Republicans, or vice versa. So if I'm in a 75% Democratic district, I don't ever have to worry about doing anything with Republicans because it doesn't matter in the congressional district that I represent. Is that a problem,
John, on that
Norm?
point, I saw this chart the other day, and what stuck out of me was that 217 Republicans were elected from districts carried by Mitt Romney.
It's a safe Republican district,
Yeah.
and they're a safe Democratic district as well.
And they're going to have to toe the line. It's not going to be easy to be compromising.
Mark, you have a comment?
I would just add that the peak of the complaining about the redistricting typically happens right after the redistricting.
Yeah.
And what needs to happen is there needs to be groups in every state that start now to figure out how do we change the redistricting in our state in the next census. And one of the things that we'd like to study here at the Graduate School of Political Management is what's the best and worst practices. I'd love to have a ranking of states 1 through 50 as to who's got the best process for getting balanced districts and who's got the worst, and try to get some attributes. So that's clearly an issue we can.
Washington State went from a partisan system to an independent group, which is one person appointed from each of the caucuses in the state legislature, and then they pick a chairman. That has worked very well and has been very fair. So I throw that out as one possibility.
You know, when you come, as I did, winning by 155 votes in a 290,000 cast, you're worried about the general election, and more members of Congress worried about the general election as opposed to the primary is going to create a much more focus on how do we get things done together.
I didn't think it worked too well in Washington State. You don't have, one Republican in the
No, you've got four Republicans and 6 Democrats. And one of the Republicans is expecting. So, I mean, everything is working.
We're building a majority.
Byron Dorgan has a comment.
John, I think probably Tom Daschle and I served a combined 60 years representing Dakotas, North and South Dakota, which are quite Republican, actually. I mean, in North Dakota, I think 2 times in a century, they voted for a Democrat for president. And I'm not sure they really felt good about it. but they did. But it seems to me, 2 Democrats serving the Dakotas for a combined nearly 60 years. My experience as somebody who came from a state in which you really had to be aware and have an antenna about what the politics of that state was. You couldn't take for granted, well, I'm a Democrat from a Democratic House district, and therefore, you know what, it doesn't matter much what I do, I'm going to be reelected. I think more competitive races are really important. I think that's an element that really requires you to reach out more and to be less partisan. And I think the point that's been made about redistricting, I think that's had a pretty significant impact, not in a positive way, on our country.
I might make a point, though. It's that way because of the law, because of the Justice Department, and because of the federal judiciary has been a big part of that in parts of the country, at any rate. Now, maybe in Washington State not, but it's pretty hard. You know, that has led to a lot of gerrymandering to make sure you meet certain criteria that have been required by the law.
Much of that, but Trent, you look at some of those lines, and you'd have to have a lot. You'd have to have a lot to drink to draw lines like that. I mean, that's
called gerrymandering.
We know what that's about.
Well, members aggressively favor gerrymandering in their favor. I mean, they lobby for it regularly. We've had a great discussion, but some of the questions I presented, maybe have a question, time for a question or two from the audience, maybe, before we break. Yes, sir.
Jerry Seppa, Dean of the Mansion School at LSU. I just wanted to respectfully challenge Senator Dorgan and Senator Lincoln along this horrible problem, being a little sarcastic here, of 24-hour news coverage. I'm glad as a voter that senators don't have a 6-year cocoon anymore. I'm not going to defend talk radio, but I think I will defend cable TV and social media and the internet in general. I think it's great that I can tune in anytime. You know, the quality of the journalism might vary, but
Which station do you turn in on?
Well, I tune into CNN, but you know, it's a personal choice. But I think it's great that Congress is subject to, usually great, that Congress is subject to 24-hour attention. And I'm delighted that senators don't have a 6-year cocoon anymore.
6-year what?
You mentioned a 6-year cocoon. And I think it's great that that doesn't exist. So
well, those that created this system of ours created a Senate in which the saucer would cool the coffee, and that you would not worry so much about the prevailing passions of the moment. The Senate was to be the stabilizing force. But I don't think I talked about the 24 news hours. I don't think that was my language. You know, the news is news. It's not clear to me who's a journalist anymore, but still, the news is the news, and I agree with Jefferson that you know, one of the last things you'd want to do for the protection of democracy is impinge the opportunity for journalists to do their work.
Blanche?
I would just say that I don't have any problem with transparency and transparency of what's going on in the Senate, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever. But one thing I will say is that it is time and money that members have to deal with. Raising the money to be able to deal with all of what's coming through the media and how much they have to answer to that takes up time and money. And raising, Tom mentioned the money. I mean, it's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. But if you don't do it, somebody else will. And then their message comes out, and they can say anything they want about you. I know, because they did. And they spend money, you know, nickel after nickel, making sure that it's going out there. The other thing is if people want information, that's a good thing. I don't have a problem with that. But more so than not, because the American families don't have the time that they want to have to do the things that they want to do, they don't necessarily go to media outlets for information. They go to hear what they want to hear. So they go to an outlet that's going to tell them exactly what they want to hear, as opposed to maybe what they need to know in terms of the details. So I don't have a problem with transparency whatsoever, but I would prefer to see that transparency coming through the regular order of committee hearings and committee markups and the actual procedures of the Senate and the House, as opposed to just nonstop reporting, because I agree that sometimes it's hard to tell what's reporting and what is just entertainment.
Let's take one more question. It seems to me like more and more people are just watching Fox or just watching MSNBC to confirm their own thinking. I don't know. Former Congressman Dennis Hertel. Dennis?
Well, you know, Jefferson always said you had to have an educated citizenry for a democracy. And in my lifetime, I'm hearing more today about the Founding Fathers and what they desired and what they did and what they said than I ever have before. How can we educate the public to that ideal of compromise, because we wouldn't even have a United States Senate or a nation without the Founding Fathers believing in compromise?
You know, I like to tell a story. One time I had worked with Senator Kennedy on a Disability for Children Act, and I was in my state, and I actually made mention to this civic club that I had worked with Senator Kennedy on this piece of legislation. The Civic Club didn't react particularly, but when it was over, an old guy from back of the room, an old curmudgeon type guy, came up and he said, you know, you did fine with your remarks there, but that part about Kennedy, don't say that no more. Here's another example. In 2007, I worked in support of, try to find a way to get an immigration reform bill. Because of that, I incurred the wrath of some talk radio, and they jammed my phones for 2 weeks, and it was ugly, and I got 3 death threats. But I also made an effort to go to my own constituency through the news outlets and newsletter and say, this is why I'm involved and this is what I'm trying to do. I never had a problem with my own constituency, but that is something you have to deal with now. Yeah, we want transparency. I was in Atlanta airport and a guy came up to me in Atlanta and said, who are you supporting to be chairman of the House Energy Committee? He said, this guy from Michigan, Fred Upton, may be chairman. We don't want him as chairman. All right, I'm in Atlanta. I'm a retired senator, and this guy knows about the competition to be chairman of a committee in the House, and he wasn't even from Michigan. So they have a lot of knowledge, and that's good, but I do think that it puts additional pressure, as Blanche says, on the members, House and Senate. You better tell your constituency what you're up to, what you're trying to do. Most of the time, if you try to explain it, or if you do, even if they disagree, they'll forgive you.
We're going to have 2 more responses, then we'll adjourn. Norm?
I just, briefly, one of the things that was said earlier was about, and Trent said this, that there is some reason for optimism. This group that's working on immigration in the Senate, I think, is a positive sign. But ultimately, it gets back to the voters, and the voters are going to have to act strategically. And I heard in the 2012 campaign, even though I wasn't directly involved, a lot of people saying, we want you to compromise, and we want you to go back there and get something done on a bipartisan basis. If we can get more of that out there, and people who are going to insist on that, then and they're going to elect people that are going to do that, there may be some hope. But I think it ultimately winds up being in the hands of the people. They have to push the politicians to do the right thing.
Last 2, Tom and Blanche.
John, just building on what Norm said, there have been a couple of polls that have caught my attention the last 6 months or so. The question asked, do you want your member of Congress to stand their ground or find common ground? And it's about a 2-to-1, stand your ground. The 1 is stand your ground, the 2/3 are find common ground. But I think those who advocate standing your ground are much more vocal and are much more organized. I think those of us who believe in finding common ground really have to be more vocal and far more insistent that members of Congress find common ground. Today, I don't think we're as good on message as those who want members to stand their ground are.
Blanche?
I think
Well,
Tom's right, and one of the ways to find that common ground is to go back to the process, and we've talked about regular order and process, but Dennis brings up a tremendous issue, and that is education. The issues here that are not sexy, like education and hunger and, you know, all of those different things. I voted for No Child Left Behind, not because it was perfect, but it was a good start. But those are 5-year bills. They're supposed to be readdressed every 5 years, whether it's transportation or whether it's education or a farm bill or, you know, all of those. And it's been 12 years since ESEA has been dealt with. I don't know, and I'm a mother with children in public schools, but if my children were in the 3rd or 4th grade right now, I'd be fuming that we had not used the knowledge of what we could have done to improve on what we started with in No Child Left Behind and ESEA, and done what we're supposed to do in that process, and every 5 years look at it. So I think you got to go back to some kind of a process that really helps you stay on the mark of what you're doing, and keeping those kind of things going.